thanks for the invitation to come along. And, I do feel like a bit of an imposter. I've been in 3 forums in the last couple of weeks where people have talked about Geelong as the poster child of resilience and about how you should look at what Geelong's doing, their recovery, doing all that sort of stuff. So I feel like I'm sort of coming to the home of resilience. But hopefully what I've got to say is useful in that context, as Kylie said, about thinking about the future. When I talk about regional resilience, I'm talking about, that's a kind of catch-all phrase, I'm really talking about how communities, and that could go right down to the household scale, or it could be a business, it could be a community or a town or a city, think about their future. So I'm not just talking about the broad region, it's the bits within that region, and of course all of those things interact. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about why we need to think about resilience, why do I think we need to think about resilience, a little bit about some of the principles, and this comes from work, as you know, Kylie obviously sits on RDAC, and the work that I'm talking about in terms of the principles is some work we did for RDAC to try and think about Victorian communities that are in transition. So, all of us are familiar, more so than anyone here in Geelong particularly, but all of our regions, all of our communities right across the state and right across the country are in transition from, traditional production, traditional manufacturing, agricultural, all that high dependence on those sort of sectors through to a kind of new world. And they're all in transition, and some are further advanced and some are further behind. But the reality is we're all sort of in transition, and RDAC did a little bit of work last year about trying to think about, well, how does government support regions that are in transition? Our traditional approach has been structural adjustment, investment. We've seen over the last few weeks some of the Auditor General's sort of comments about, I guess, some of the issues around how you do that and about how you create objectives and set objectives and track those and all of that sort of stuff. But the thing the Auditor General's report didn't go into is what's the philosophy behind helping regions adapt and change and transition. And I guess some of this work behind the scenes that RDAC was doing was to try and think about that, is what's the philosophy behind how we're trying to help regions to change. And then I want to talk about my vision for sort of regional resilience and how we might think about that. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners, but I also want to acknowledge this lady for helping to crystallise some of the thinking around resilience, and I'll come back to that. It's really important little idea that she's seeded. So first of all, why resilience? Why do we need to think about resilience? The world's always changed. People have always changed. Humans have been, the reason we are like we are is because we're great adapters. The world changes around us and we respond and adapt, and there's really clear evidence now that our brains are built and structured the way they are because of the changes we've been exposed to. So we are capable of adapting, and in fact there's really clear evidence that climate change, previous climate change, was really important in shaping our brains and our ability to adapt in the past. So I'm talking about when we're emerging in the Rift Valley, the rapid climate change there was one of the things that selected us out of a bunch of other possible kind of forms of humans, and it helped to shape our brains. We've always responded and adapted. We've always built tools to change the world around us, and nothing's changed about that. But something really important did happen when we started to do it on an industrial scale, the Industrial Revolution, about how we shape the world around us. That had enormous impacts, and we've all benefited from that. And if we just look at, interesting, given your last conversation you were having just before the break there, this is internet use worldwide since 1990. Starts at about 2 million people down there in 1990, is up to sort of 3.5 billion people now. And I think what's really interesting is this is North America. It's kind of flatlined. Basically everyone there is on the net, or just about everyone who will be, is going to be on the net, is on the net. But if you look at some of those others in the middle there, the sort of pink and the orange up here, they're East Asia, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, etc. So there's another whole chunk of the world that's going to come online with us and join us in that world. And I was pleased to hear someone mentioning the Internet of Things. So the bottom grey part here is traditional things, your phone and your computer. The red part is the Internet of Things. That's all the other stuff that's connected to the internet. So that's going to outweigh far and away, you know, we think of the internet as being about computers. It's actually all this other stuff. Our whole lives are enmeshed in this kind of system. And so we're not just connected and we're not just interconnected, we've become interdependent. There's this interdependence now that's locking us in at a global scale. So it's not just, so for someone sitting in a regional community, they're not just part of that regional community, they're also connected to this global scale, to this global system. That brings with it a lot of complexity, and I'm not just talking about wires and stuff complexity, I'm talking about the interactions between social and economic and ecological, the way the world now is intermeshed. It's never been like it before. So we're living in a totally new era in terms of that complexity and interdependence. We're connected now in a way we've never been connected. I was doing some work in Bangladesh last year. We're on the border with India, right down in the south, in the mangrove forests, so the Sundarbans, the incredible, you know, area. These people, the most vulnerable people on the planet from a climate change perspective, incredibly remote. There was virtually nothing Western that you could see looking around. They had these aluminium pots that the women carry water in. Everything else basically was made from stuff around them, mud, bamboo, thatched roofs, etc. And yet we're sitting in a little meeting clustered in this person's hut, and the biggest pain in the butt was the fact that everyone's mobile phone was going off every few seconds. They had 4G coverage. That country has 100% coverage of 4G, and every person has a mobile. And the saris, the traditional saris that the women wear now, have stitched into it a mobile phone pocket. And you know, the world has changed so much, and theoretically, that means we can be in contact with those people, they can be in contact with us. They were working on, one of the things we were there was looking at these little startup for a few $100, supporting women to start companies to weave mats. You know, they're looking for markets, and it's like they can connect to us now. We can be buying their mats for $2 or whatever they're worth, and having an impact economically, and vice versa. The world's complex and interconnected in ways it's never been. That brings with it also some challenges, so don't worry about the detail of these graphs, but basically what they show along the bottom is from 1750 through to 2010, and the dashed line in the middle there is 1950. These are some of the sort of, you know, resources that we rely on and things that we put out into the world as we use those resources: carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, etc., etc. And the ones below that are all the same as well. Don't worry about the detail, it's the shape of the curves. And if you look, that's in the sort of biophysical stuff, this is in the social stuff. If we look at population, GDP, energy use, urban population, water use, etc., it's the shape of the curve that's the same. And that's the important part here. We're in this period from the 1950s on, it's called the Great Acceleration. So we're living in an era that we've never been in as people, as humans on the planet, where you have this, you know, this escalation of the kind of human enterprise on the globe. That brings with it all the wealth that you see around us that we all enjoy, but it also brings all these feedbacks. Because of that complexity, because of the interconnectedness, it brings a number of challenges and things that we haven't dealt with before. In Australia, we know about on the front line of climate change and is confronting about, you know, that's one of the feedbacks is we've changed the climate, and the feedback from that is more shocks from climate, like bushfire, these sort of storm events, etc. You would have seen the last few days, the UN's just released a report looking on the biodiversity outlook, a million species headed for extinction, massive declines in things that are really important for just human survival, like insect populations declining by 40% worldwide. That has real implications for food production, for waste treatment, for all sorts of things that they do. But it's not just in the natural world. You know, these sort of figures, the 7 richest people in Australia hold more wealth than 1.73 million households. The 85 richest people on the planet have more wealth than 50% of the population on the planet. So 85 people with more wealth than 50%. And that's showing up in other ways too. That sort of, this kind of instability, if you like, is in the political system. And we're seeing, you know, not just here, but in the Arab Spring in the Middle East, in, you know, South America, things we're seeing happening in terms of political dynamics. There's feedbacks when you change systems, when you intervene, when you see the sort of wealth, the escalation, the rapid escalation of wealth, the movement of resources, all of these things have these kind of interconnected impacts and then feedbacks back through the system, creates instability, and that creates uncertainty. When we think about resilience, resilience is about coping with those shocks, those feedbacks, those things that come back at us from the system, but also about coping with that uncertainty and trying to plan in a world that's experiencing instability and is quite uncertain. So how do we think about this? So, the kind of summary, if you like, of why we need resilience. Humans are the dominant force on the planet now. We're shaping the planet like we've never shaped before. That brings with it a whole lot of feedbacks that connect back to us, that impact on our lives in lots of different ways, both through climate change, but also through political instability, through technological instability, through economic instability. Donald Trump tweeted yesterday that he might, up the tariffs on the Chinese imports. That caused the Beijing Stock Exchange to drop 6%. So a tweet, a couple of lines from some maniac on one side of the world causes, real consequences reverberating through the system. So how do we think about that? Well, resilience is one of the ways to think about it. It's not the only way, but it's one of the tools, one of the approaches. And lots of people around the world are trying to think about resilience. And I have the same conversations. What's really interesting to me is I have the same conversations in rooms like with the villagers in Bangladesh. You have the same conversations in the US, in Africa, in the EU, in Scandinavia, in the UK, as I have with people here in rooms around the country here. Resilience is about a mindset, and that's where the Queen comes back in. In 2008, she went to the London School of Economics, prestigious economics school. It was during the financial crisis. They were showing her all their capacity to think about all this stuff, and she asked a really simple question. She said, if you're all so smart, why didn't you see the financial crisis coming? It's a really good question to a bunch of people like that. And to their credit, I would have loved to have been in that room that day when she sort of asked that question. Everyone would have been looking at each other. It's kind of like, you answer it, no, you answer it, you answer it. They went away, they teamed up with the British Academy, and they went away and thought about it and actually went back to her. And this is the letter. There's a 3-page letter that went back to the Queen that says, you asked this question, here's our response. What's really interesting is for me when I read that letter is that it actually crystallises the challenge of what we're trying to do and what a group like you are trying to do, to think about how do we develop, how do we support a region to move into the future and cope with change and take the opportunities. And, it says lots of things, but here's just a couple of things that were really important. One was the over-reliance on expert judgment. So I'm not slagging off at experts. I like to think of myself as an expert. We're all experts in something. But expert judgment has limits. Expert judgment is pattern recognition. That's what's at the core of expertise, is pattern recognition. Experts can look at a situation, they see the points, the data points, the signals, and the messages from that, and they can compare it to what they've seen before. And they've seen lots of things before. That's what expertise you build up over time. You build up a lot of history and experience. They compare that, what they can see, with that pattern in their brain, and they make a judgment on that. They say, this looks similar to that. I think the best course of action would be to do this. That's how expertise works. That's fine when things don't change much. But we've got a system that's changing rapidly. No one has been in this situation before. Humans have never been in this situation before, where we're connected to most people on the planet, where it's changing so rapidly, where we're so interdependent. So the patterns of the past aren't as useful for the future. And that's a real challenge. That's a real challenge, because most of us have grown up in a period of relative stability. Even though there's that hockey stick, things have been changing rapidly since the 1950s, we've essentially just been the benefit or beneficiaries of that change. We haven't really had to engage deeply. There's been, minor crisis, but basically politically it's been relatively stable. It's been economically relatively stable. The world has been in a relatively good place for the last 50 to 70 years. That's coming to an end, and we're in a period of transition, and actually most of our institutions are built on that stability thinking. And we're not in that period anymore. We're moving into another sort of phase. And so the way governance and governments work is very much built on what we've done in the past, and we're seeing that breaking down. And I think the whole RDAC's exploration of this about, how do we help regions transition, because in the past we basically sort of, helped with structural adjustment sort of payments, that just wasn't working as well. And I think that's one of the symptoms of the fact that the world's changing and expertise isn't as useful. So things like models and predictions that we've used traditionally are perform fairly poorly and when things are changing, because models are all, they're an abstraction of reality. They're based on the reality, but they're an abstraction, and then they're based on a whole lot of assumptions. And again, when the world changes rapidly, your assumptions, it's hard to make good assumptions. So I worked with a bunch of irrigators in northern Victoria a while ago. We got together and talked about, what do we think the future will be like? What are the big assumptions that we think we need to make about the future? They couldn't envisage a drought that would last more than 2 years. And we were already in a drought that was nearly 2 years old, and yet they couldn't see it continuing. And yet, obviously they went into a longer period of drought. The assumptions really matter. That's the key thing, and models are only as good as the assumptions. We get focused on the fast, the short-term issues, and in the financial sector where this came from, of course, that was about financial returns, but it's the same for any issue. If you go to a regional community at the moment, they'll talk about the issue that's most important to them right then. They're not really thinking long-term because that's not how we're built. So, of course, that's the political noise, that's what governments respond to, it's what the media responds to, the thing that's right in front of people's faces, and so that's where the money flows. And so that gets all the attention, but in fact the power actually sits underneath that, is understanding how the system really works. So if you're focused on the fast and you're focused on the parts, you can't really see the whole. You tend to make investments or decisions about dealing with that immediate thing rather than thinking about how the whole system works and where the intervention should be placed, better placed to make a change. A critical, point for the financial crisis was the failure to understand the interconnectedness and the interdependencies of the system, and I think it's the same for a lot of the stuff we do. A little example of this, working with a community in Western New South Wales. I don't know if this is still the same, but it used to be that Centrelink would only, if you're in an area that had low job prospects, there was slightly different rules. You didn't have to apply for as many jobs, and that was determined by postcode. So if you were in a postcode that had low socioeconomic status and low economic prospects, you only had to apply for I can't remember the exact figures, but it was a substantially smaller number of jobs that you had to apply for in order to qualify for Centrelink payments. So what do you think happened in a community? There was a big town and a small town. The small town was considered to be one of these designated postcodes. We didn't have to look for as many jobs. People migrated across to here. That brought with it a whole lot of social problems, and people in the town were very clear about this, and it wasn't profiling. They had the evidence. There was people coming from that bigger town to live in this postcode because they didn't have to look for as many jobs. They brought with them a whole lot of drugs and issues that then started to have an impact on kids in the town. It was a small town but with a big catchment for its school. People from the outlying places, the pastoralists particularly, so this is in Western New South and the dry areas, started to send their kids to the bigger town. So they were dodging the local school and going to the bigger town. The local school closed. That was unrelated to the unemployment issue. It was unrelated to the Centrelink determinations and all of that sort of stuff. But actually that was a social result of that. People in that town knew that story really well. They knew why the school had closed. And yet, if you went to government and sort of said, the school closed because you changed the rules and allowed people, no one's going to listen. But actually that's the interconnectedness. That's a systemic view of the relationships and the interactions. People who live in places know this stuff well. You know it about Geelong, you know it about the communities you come from in the Barwon region. You know how they work. When we design things from outside, we often get it wrong because we don't really understand those connections. And then the final one, which I really liked, was their kind of final line to the Queen was, this was a failure of imagination, the collective imagination. That basically they didn't think the financial crisis could happen. And I find this a lot dealing with communities. We work a lot with communities to talk about the future. People just don't think it's going to happen there, or this won't happen to us, but they also have a failure of imagination about the opportunities as well. And I get really frustrated, like every bloody town I go to talks about putting an RV dump for the, grey nomads. It's like, for God's sake, there's only so many grey nomads. They don't want to spend any money in your town. There's only so many tourists. And do we really want to have a kind of, sewerage-led kind of recovery of towns? Like, is that how we should be thinking? But that's the kind of failure of this, we often don't have the imagination to think about a different future.
It's not only that, there's a type of failure of compassion going on at the moment. Like you talk about resilience here. We have large swathes of that are being left behind by deliberate government policy. You know, and I think there's some really big questions. It's not the imagination, unless of course people can't imagine the fact that everybody deserves a go and to be supported and all that sort of stuff. That's what really drives me insane about this stuff.
I agree. I mean, I agree. I work a lot with Aboriginal communities. I work a lot with people in, and I think one of our biggest issues in this country is dealing with how to help people live with dignity, and that's not part of the debate. You know, we always talk about jobs, and of course jobs are part of that, I know, but actually if we start with those core things about compassion and dignity, but anyway, we could start a long discussion about that. So what does it mean? How do we think about this? So we've got this kind of swirling stuff. We're all connected in this global system. When you look at the way we plan, and you know, this has been my bread and butter for a long period of time, is to try and think about how we plan for the future. That's cut off at the bottom. That says unanticipated down the bottom. So if you think about one axis that's anticipated versus unanticipated, and if you think about this other axis of sort of more destructive things through to more creative. Do you want to go? Yeah, just that might work actually. Thanks. If you think about those kind of two axes, we're often planning up here. We're kind of in a defensive mode. So we're working on things that we know are probably going to happen, or we think are going to happen, and we're worried about loss. Humans are more worried about loss than gain. So that's just the way our brains are built. So it makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary point of view. If I've made a stone tool and I've had to go and walk for miles to get the rock and chip it all out, I'd be more worried about losing that than the potential that I might find one over there or whatever. So I'm more worried about loss than I am about gain. So a lot of our planning tends to be over here, and a lot of our thinking, and it tends to be mostly on things that we can anticipate. We do a little bit in the creative, we do a little bit in this kind of unanticipated, but really we tend to be focusing on the threats that we know about, and we tend to worry about the losses. We really don't do a lot of thinking over here. And I'm talking predominantly about government planning here and about sort of government intervention. Entrepreneurs are over here, you know, and we can learn a lot from the way people, you know, in private sector think about things. And the mindset, if you like, is kind of bureaucratic, and I'm not being disparaging to bureaucrats because I'm a recovering bureaucrat myself, but you know, this is sort of more bureaucratic. This is about risk and managing, you know, the sort of the loss of things. This is more about creation. This is more entrepreneurial, and we're not that good over here. That's the reality. So there's individuals who are really good at it, and they tend to start companies, and those companies become successful, etc. But as a society, we're not very good at doing that. And we don't have that sort of social entrepreneurship kind of built into our thinking very strongly at all. So when we're thinking about planning and how we go about these things, we're often, you know, reverting to this kind of planning. And to be honest, that's the sort of work we've done for a long period of time, is sort of working with communities to manage their risks, really. That misses out on a lot of opportunities that we could have identified. And I'll come back to that in a second. So the work with RDAC was to look at some principles that could help guide us, and the aim would be to have a set of principles that a group like this could use. I'm not saying that you necessarily pick these up, but it's a group like this who's trying to think about the future in different ways, to have some principles that could guide your thinking. They're obviously sort of non-binding, but they're there to help think about how you make decisions. They're there to guide decision making, and they're also there to evaluate how things are tracking and how different proposals might work, etc. So if we take that sort of broad definition of resilience about the capacity of a system to cope, and like I said before, that system could be a household, or it could be a business, or it could be a town or a regional community or a city, to cope with change, and that change could be expected or unexpected, or anticipated, unanticipated. So, you know, things that we know are going to happen and shocks that sort of surprise us, and to maximise opportunities. So if we think about those two parts to that, to cope with change and to maximise opportunities, this sort of set of principles was developed to try and think that through. I'm not going to go through these in a huge amount of detail, but one is to develop that complexity view. And this is a really strategic kind of thing. It's instead of, you know, sort of thinking about just the parts, the silos, starting to think about how the world's connected and how it really works, and those linkages between the bits and across scales, from that local scale to the international scale or wherever. it sounds simple, but we need to actually plan for change. Most of our planning is planning with the assumption of certainty. Most of the plans that you look at now have one future. So they say, you know, we're going to do this into the future, not recognising the fact that there's multiple possible futures, and those multiple possible futures could play out depending on a whole range of factors. And climate change planning is the most obvious one of those, where, you know, we could be planning for a climate that looks like this or a climate that looks like that, but it's the same socially, it's the same economically. There's lots of potential futures that we could be having. So actually planning for change rather than planning for stability and planning for uncertainty. And a lot of times we don't do that. We actually plan. If you look at, you know, we did a review of 25 plans, different scale plans when I was working at CSIRO, looking at different types of plans out there that